Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Allgore. I'm the president of the Massachusetts Historical Society, and I'm so pleased to welcome you to this event. You know, it's sometimes hard to get a crowd together on a cool fall evening right after a holiday, but you have made the right choice. This is a special night, and you're going to be glad you were here. With such a large crowd, I assume, for some of you, this is your first visit to us at the MHS, so you get a particular welcome. We are the oldest historical society in America, and we remain an independent, nonprofit organization. We have a research library with 13 million manuscripts documenting American history, and it's open to the public, and it's free of charge. So you can just come in and find out about your family or find out about your town right here. We offer programs like this to the public, academic audiences, and educators. We're really at the end of the fall season, but I would still encourage you to pick up a calendar on your way out. We still have a few good things. And the new calendar will be out soon. And I want to let you know about the next two public programs. We'll be hosting Russell Shorto on Thursday to speak on his new book, Revolution Song. And on December 13, Manisha Singha will give a talk on her book, The Slave's Cause. So that's all before the holidays. I do want to say that all the things we do, we make our resources and our programs open to the public. We're able to do that through the generosity of our donors, our members, our supporters, some of who I'm seeing tonight. So if you like tonight and you're not a member of the MHS, please join us in this. I think you'll consider, you'll find it's a worthy cause. So tonight, we are joined by two Harvard professors, Maria Tatar and Henry Louis Gates, Jr. So Professor Tatar is the John L. Lowe Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures. She chairs the program in folklore and mythology at Harvard University, where she teaches courses in German studies, folklore, and children's literature. Henry Louis Gates is the Alphonse Fletcher University Professor and the Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University. He is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker, a literary scholar, a journalist, a cultural critic, an overseer, and a long-term friend of the MHS. So together they have published the new Annotated African American Folktales, which I see some of you have. It's quite a weighty tome. And this new publication, it gathers together nearly 150 African American stories, among them the familiar Brer Rabbit classics, but also stories like The Talking Skull and The Witches Who Ride, as well as out-of-print tales from the 1890s Southern Workman. So tonight, they're going to share a few of the folk tales and then explain their process of selecting them, why they feel these stories are an important part of understanding the African American experience, and why they should be taught as part of the American literary canon. So please join me in welcoming Maria Tatar and Henry Louis Gates, Jr.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so, thank you for that very kind introduction, and thanks to each of you for coming out on Monday after Thanksgiving weekend. It's quite extraordinary to see you. I was remembering when I first came here to give a talk, Peter Gomes. How many of you knew Peter Gomes? Yeah, Peter Gomes was my man. Peter was on Plymouth Rock when the Puritans. And I was so nervous, and I don't know why I was so nervous, but I think I was afraid Cotton Mather was going to come jumping out of it. But I love this place, and I was telling a young person here, a student, that one of its extraordinary holdings among all those 13 million this and that, one of them is Phyllis Wheatley's desk. And for those of you who don't know, Phyllis Wheatley's the first black poet in English, and she published a book of poems on September 5th, 1773 in London, because nobody in Boston would believe that an African had the requisite intellectual ability to write a book of poetry. And her actual desk is here, which is, so really, if I'm driving by or I walk in, and several times we filmed here for Finding Your Roots. It's a beautiful place to film. But when I'm driving by or walking by, I think there's old Phyllis up there on the 3rd floor, so it's great. I've always loved folk tales because my father was a great storyteller. Some of you have heard me talk about my father many times. He lived to be 97 and a half, and he loved stories, and which in our culture were called lies. And my father would tell, I have one brother, Dr. Paul Gates, is the chief of dentistry at Bronx Lebanon Hospital. And he's 5 years older than I am. And Daddy would be telling us some story. And my mother, Pauline Augusta, that beautiful name, Coleman Gates, would say, Heine. He was born in 1930, his name was Henry, but his nickname was Heine because of German influence. And she'd say, Heine, stop telling those boys those lies. So I always loved those lies. And the idea that I would ever be editing a collection of African-American folktales just never occurred to me until Maria called me one day. And now it's your turn to tell where this idea came from.
Well, let me say I'm thrilled to be here with my co-conspirator, my collaborator, and I was fortunate enough to spend a year at the Hutchins Center working with Skip and with the scholars there. And to be here with this volume, which we had to put an end to it at a certain point, but there was one story, of course, led to another. And we were immersed in the ocean of story. We were stirring the cauldron of story. I think our hope really is that this will be just the beginning of other collections, that this will direct other scholars to the sources that we have a long bibliography and to those sources. And we also have all kinds of plans for the future with this collection. But I think tonight what we wanted to do was to start with some stories, and we will keep them fairly short. The beauty of these folk tales is that they are often quite compact, and because I think the tellers wanted to leave, leave space for conversation, for discussion, because these are stories that are just deceptively simple. And when you start unpacking them, you realize how complicated and deep and profound they are, and how it's not the story that shapes our values, but the conversations about those stories. So I think we were going to start out with treachery, disloyalty, treachery and death. And Skip, are you going to start with the scorpion and the frog?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Great.
And I'm going to tell, we have a printed version, and I'm going to try to do it like my father would do it. So all the animals in the kingdom were on this island, and the island caught on fire. And so the frog goes to the shore, and he's ready to get in the water and save himself. And just as he's about to get in the water, the scorpion says, Mr. Frog, I can't swim. And unless you give me a ride, I'm going to die. And the frog said, Scorpion, why would I give you a ride? You're a scorpion, man. You know, you try to sting me all the time and try to kill me. You know, get out of here. And he goes, well, look at it this way, Mr. Frog. If I sting you while you're swimming away, we both would die. So why would I do that? That's not rational. The frog thinks about it and says, okay, get on. Everything is cool. Frog is stroking. Scorpion's on his back. All of a sudden, he feels this giant pain. He looks up and he realizes the scorpion has stung him. And he's about to go down to drown. He's, Mr. Scorpion, why did you do that? And the scorpion says, because it's my nature.
Actually, our plan was to go on to flying Africans and witches and shine in the Titanic. But since Skip told that particular story so beautifully and gave us the punchline, it's in my nature, I think what follows the telling of a story like that is the question of treachery, obviously, but also nature versus nurture. And I want to read the ending of an African dilemma tale. These were stories that were told in a communal setting. This particular one is called A Vital Decision. It's about the son of a rat catcher who's thrown out of the house by his father, by his cruel, abusive father, is then raised by a wealthy man, and one day his rat catcher father comes looking for him and wants him back in the house and promises him all kinds of great things. So here's what happens. In the evening they departed, First the poor man, that's the rat catcher, then behind him on horseback the rich man, and finally the son. Right in the midst of the bush, the rich man stopped and said, "I want to return home." "That's fine, farewell," the poor man said. The rich man dismounted and took the young man's hand. "What do you want?" the poor man asked, "now that he has become my son again?" The rich man drew his sword and gave it to the young man. "If you want to go with your father, then kill me. If you want to stay with me, then kill your father. Unless you come with me, I don't want to return home." The young man stood between the two men with the sword drawn. Should he kill his father, the man who had raised him, but who had also nearly killed him, just for the sake of a rat? Then people would say that he had killed him for the sake of the money. Or should he kill the rich man, the man who had helped him and made him wealthy, which meant that he would be returning to catching rats? He had no idea what to do. And if the three of them are not already dead, then they are no doubt still standing there.
Oh, that's great.
End of story. Not happily ever after.
No.
So
So you want me to pick up one?
you want to go? Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
This is from Zora Hurston's collection, Mules and Men. And you know that she was a great novelist who was quite celebrity in her time and then was lost. She was on the cover of the Saturday Review of Literature in 1940 for her autobiography. And by the early 50s, she'd become a conservative Republican. She was back in Florida. She was working as a maid. And then, just literally, I think she died in like 59 or 60. And then was out of print. Her most famous novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, was certainly out of print. And was resurrected by Alice Walker and the Black feminists in the 70s, and now sells hundreds of thousands of copies a year. But she studied anthropology at Columbia under Franz Boas, and could have been a great anthropologist. But she refused to obey the rules. She would intervene, and you know, you're supposed to be clinical and outside. But I love this. These are the John stories, and my father told these stories all the time, and they're origin stories. And so this is called John, the First Colored Man. Now, one of the things that many of these stories are written in dialect, but the paradox of dialect is that the people who speak dialect wouldn't write it that way. If a person says this or that, in their mind they are saying T-H-I-S or T-H-A-T. So sometimes I find it hard myself to read the dialect, and I just do it. My father never told a story in dialect. He would just tell the story in kind of a black language, but it would be musical, but it wouldn't be like the dialect. But so I'm going to play, I'll probably slip back and forth between registers. The first colored man, what was brought to this country, was named John. He didn't know nothing more than you told him, and he never forgot nothing you told him either. So he was sold to a white man. Things he didn't know, he would ask about. They went to a house, and John never seen a house, so he asked what it was. Old Massa told him it was his kingdom. So they goes on into the house, and there was the fireplace. John asked what was that. Old Massa told him it was his flame evaporator. The cat was sitting there. He asked what was that. Old Massa told him it was his round head. So they went upstairs. When he got on upstairs, he asked what day was. Old Massa told him it was his Jacob ladder. So when they got upstairs, he had a roller foot bed. John asked what was that. Old Massa told him it was his flowery bed of ease. So they came down and went out to the lot. He had a barn. John asked what was that. Old Massa told him that was his mound. So he had a jack in the stable, jackass, too. And John asked, what in the world is that? And Old Massa said, that's July, the goddamn. So the next day, Old Massa was upstairs asleep, and John was smoking. It flamed the evaporator, and the cat was sitting there, and it got set afire. The cat goes to the barn, where Old Massa had lots of hay and fodder in the barn. So the cat set it on fire. John watched the jack kicking up hay and fodder. He would see the hay and fodder go up and come down, but he thought the jack was eating the hay and fodder. So he goes upstairs and calls Old Massa and told him to get up off in his flowery bed of ease and come on down his Jacob ladder. He said, I'd inflamed the vaporator, and it caught the round head and set him on fire. He's gone to the mound and set it on fire, and July the goddamn is eating up everything he can to get his mouth on. And Master turned over in bed and asked, "What's that? What are you talking about, John?" And John told him again. Master was still sleepy, so he asked John again, "What did you say?" John was getting tired. So you know what he said? "Oh, you better get out of that bed and come on downstairs. I didn't set that old cat on fire," and he run out the barn and set it on fire, and that old jackass is eating up everything he get his mouth on.
Can we go from the profane to the sacred?
Yes, we can. Hey, we wrote the book. We can do anything we want.
This is a short one, but it will be a pathway into a longer story, and I'll read the beginning of and the end of that longer story, and then we'll go on to Shine and the Titanic and all kinds of great things. So this is Flying Africans, and Skip and I spoke recently. We're on a program for NPR, and at one point Skip said, "Flying Africans, we're at the intersection of slavery, freedom, and death." And somehow I thought that he just perfectly captured the spirit of the stories in this section. So we'll begin short and simple. This is a story told by J.D. Suggs and then collected by a folklorist named Richard Dorson. I heard about the flying man up in Arkansas at Jonesboro. The police went up to him, and the faster they walked, the faster he walked, until he just spread his arms and sailed right on off, and they never did catch him. Said he was faster than the planes. They told about him all through the South, in Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas. Some of you know what I'm leading into, the story often known as "And the People Could Fly." We have a version that is called All God's Children Had Wings, and All God's Children Had Wings, I'm going to say. And I'm going to read just the beginning. "Once all Africans could fly like birds, but owing to their many transgressions, their wings were taken away. There remained here and there, in the sea islands and out-of-the-way places in the low country, some who had been overlooked and had retained the power of flight, though they looked like other men." And now, moving to the end of the story, where we are in the fields, under the heat of the sun, with, terrible critters, and the master, the overseer, and the driver looked after them as they flew. These are the flying Africans, the men who have clapped their hands, and the women who are singing, and the children who have taken off. So the master, the overseer, and the driver looked after them as they flew beyond the wood, beyond the river, miles on miles, until they passed beyond the last rim of the world and disappeared in the sky like a handful of leaves. They were never seen again. Where they went, I do not know. I never was told, nor what it was that the old man had said. That I've forgotten. But as he went over the last fence, he made a sign in the master's face and said, "Kuliba, Kuliba." I don't know what that means. But if I could only find the old wood sawyer, he could tell you more. For he was there at the time and saw the Africans fly away with their women and children. He is an old, old man, over 90 years of age, and remembers a great many strange things. So I love the fact that the chanting is the signal to sprout wings and leave, that the words of the African language are used in an incantatory fashion. And so many of these tales, as we discovered, really are about language. They're self-reflexive, and they tell us, just as like the one that you read, about the power of language and mastery over language.
Great.
And do you want to go to Shine?
Oh, I
do.
do.
You want to talk a little bit about
No, I want to go to Shine. Shine's my man.
Yeah.
All right, everybody knows about the Titanic, right? Titanic sinks in 1912. Now, for some reason, we don't know why, but there were these two stories immediately circulated through Black America. And one was that Jack Johnson, you remember Jack Johnson was the greatest boxer in the whole world. And you saw the Great White Hope, remember that? And Hitler, no, that was Joe Louis. But Jack Johnson was fighting in, who did he fight? You know, it was like the Battle of the Races in 1910. Yes, Jim Jeffries, thank you, which is the Great White Hope. And he beats Jim Jeffries, but finally he's beaten. But Jack Johnson was notorious, and he had a lot of white female lovers, and they finally broke him up with a Mann Act and accused him of, taking a minor across the border, but it was really a woman that was his lover, right? And so he had to flee the country, and basically it ended his career. So the story, and remember, the Titanic was the White Star Line, the Cunard Line, who owned the QE2, right? A little later, Marcus Garvey, the black nationalist, comes to the United States in 1916 and announces he started the Black Star Line, which is going to take all black Americans back to Africa. But, so the Titanic sinks, and the story was that Jack Johnson had tried to get a ticket. And remember, the Titanic was unsinkable, right? And they said, no black people allowed. But there was one black person there, and he was Shine. Now, Shine was a name like nigger. It was a derogatory term for black people, because black skin in the sun would shine. So it's a metonym, Shine. And so for reasons we do not know, this rhymed poem circulated throughout black America. And it was that the one black man who was on the boat, who of course was shoveling coal in the boiler room, somehow miraculously not only escaped, but swam all the way from the middle ocean and ended up in Harlem. But he's the best swimmer. And this plays on the myth that black people can't swim. So all these people are trying to get him to save them and to jump on his back and swim back to the Statue of Liberty. And we've done a cleaned up version, because they're filthy versions, and I'll read that. This one's from the Book of American Negro Folklore, edited by Langston Hughes and Arnold Bonetime in 1958, right, I think. Okay. It was 1912 when the awful news got around that the great Titanic was sinking down. Shine came running up on deck, told the captain, please, the water in the boiler room is up to my knees. Captain said, take your black self on back. The captain said, take your black self on back down there. I got 150 pumps to keep the boiler room clear. Shine went back in the hole, started shoveling coal, singing, Lord have mercy, Lord on my soul. Just then, half the ocean jumped across the boiler room deck. Shine yelled to the captain, the water's around my neck. Captain said, go back. Neither fear nor doubt. I got 100 more pumps to keep the water out. Your words sound happy, your words sound true. But this one time, Captain, your words won't do. I don't like chicken, and I don't like ham, and I don't believe your pumps is worth a goddamn. The old Titanic was beginning to sink. Shine pulled off his clothes and jumped in the brink. He said, little fish, big fish, and shark fishes too, get out of my way because I'm coming through. Captain on the bridge hollered, Shine, Shine, save poor me. I'll make you rich as any man could be. Shine said, there's more gold on land than there is on the sea, and Shine swam on. When all them white folks went to heaven, Shine was in Sugar Ray's bar drinking Seagram 7. So there are all kind of variations. Mrs. Astor, you could get this, is on a little ice float. She lifts up her dress, offers him all the sex that a Shine could want, and he says, I have to say, he says, pussy's good, but pussy don't last. Shine gonna save his own black ass. And Shine swam, and the refrain is, and Shine swam on. So you'd have to see this in a ritual setting with a great storyteller. And then Mr. Rockefeller offers him all the money a Shine could have, and he goes, money's good, but money don't last, the same thing. My father, who was drafted right after Pearl Harbor, when, the Army was segregated, of course, till Truman's executive order of, Ted, when was it, 48? 47? 47. I always mix up the partition of India and Pakistan and the executive order. Yeah, and my father grew up in Cumberland, Maryland. It's halfway between, where all the Gateses are from. Anybody who's watched Finding Your Roots knows. It's halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington. That's where all my family for 250 years has lived. Three sets of my fourth great grandparents are free Negroes. They lived 18 miles from where I was born. It was incredible stability. So my father leaves this little island, in the Allegheny Mountains, on the Potomac River and is dropped into Camp Lee, Virginia, in Petersburg, Virginia, with all these other black people who were drafted. And these are mostly Southern black people who weren't educated. And my father used to tell my brother and me, he knew black people couldn't read and write, but knew 1,000 verses of Shine and the Titanic. And it's true. And the other one, which is related to that, is the Signifying Monkey, but it's your turn, and then I'll read the Signifying Monkey.
Oh, no, I think we should go to Signifying Monkey, and then we'll do Witches Who Ride.
Okay, that sounds great. How we doing? We're doing fine, great.
Let me just interject one thing, and that is, I remember talking to you about Shine and the Titanic, and realizing as I started reading that story and versions of it, the Titanic means something very different to African Americans. That is, you know, Titanic, tragedy, the movie, romance, all of that. And Shine, what is Shine doing? He's shoveling coal, while there's this above him, this ostentatious display of wealth and a society that has excluded him, basically. So that was somehow a moment when alarm bells went off in my head, and I realized how important it was to bring this material to light. Not that it isn't, but you know, to put it between the covers of a book and make it more accessible. And tell us about the Signifying Monkey.
Well, I love the Signifying Monkey. The Signifying Monkey, there were always three characters: the lion, the elephant, and the monkey. Now, anybody's been to the jungle, you know, to a game park knows, we were all raised to believe the lion is king of the jungle. But anybody's been to a game park or, you know, watched the Nature Channel knows it's the elephant who's the king of the jungle. So this is about pretense and self-delusion and the trickster who's the monkey. So here's the motif. The lion is, you know, so the monkey wants to see the lion get his butt beat. So he goes to the lion and persuades him that the elephant has been talking trash about him, about his wife, about his mother. It's always about your mother, insulting your mother. And the lion goes, where is he? I'm going to kick his ass. And he goes over, and the lion is minding his own business. Usually he's asleep. I mean, the elephant's minding his own business, usually asleep. And the lion goes and provokes him. The elephant wakes up, stomps the lion, beats him badly. The lion realizes he's been tricked by the trickster, and then he goes to exact revenge from the monkey. Now, this, too, is a cleaned-up version. And we publish, we say, you can find, there are many ballads, they're called toast, and jokes about the sinking of the Titanic, and some of the off-color versions can be found in Roger Abrams' Deep Down in the Jungle, and Bruce Jackson's Get Your Ass in the Water and Swim Like Me. And the same holds true for the Signifying Monkey. And I wrote a book called The Signifying Monkey, because there were all these theories about signs and signifying and signification. And I realized that black people, probably after World War I, because there's a pun in French between the French word for sign and the French word for monkey. You just reverse the G and the N in the middle. So it's a visual pun. And I figured that's probably where it came from. So here's a cleaned up version of the Signifying Monkey. The monkey and the lion got to talking one day. Monkey looked down and said, lion, I hear you's king in every way. But I know somebody who don't think that's true. He told me he could whip the living daylights out of you. Lion said, who? The monkey said, lion. He talked about your mama, talked about your grandmama too. And I'm too polite to tell you what he said about you. Lion said, who said what? Who? Monkey in the tree, lion on the ground. Monkey kept on signifying. This is, the ritual's called signifying. The only way you lose signifying is if you get angry. And signifying is when you insult each other. It's a ritual insult. And if you get angry, you've lost. If you don't get angry, you've won. But it's the common signifying. Tell your mother to send back the shoes I left under her bed last night. You know, your mother's so ugly, they have to put a sheet on her face so sleep can sneak up on her, you know, stuff like that. So that's called signifying. Monkey kept on signifying, but he didn't come down. Monkey said, his name is Elephant. He's stone sure he's not your friend. Lion said, he don't need to be because today will be his end. Lion took off through the jungle, lickety-split, meaning to grab Elephant, tear him to bit, period. He come across Elephant copping a righteous nod under a fine, cool, shady tree. Lion said, you big old no-good so-and-so, it's either you or me. Lion let out a solid roar and bopped Elephant with his paw. Elephant just took his trunk and busted old Lion's jaw. Lion let out another roar, reared up 6 feet tall. Elephant just kicked him in the belly and laughed to see him drop and fall. Lion rolled over, copped Elephant by the throat. Elephant just shook him loose and butted him like a goat. Then he tromped in and he stomped him till the Lion yelled, "Oh no!" And it was near nigh sunset when Elephant let Lion go. The signifying monkey was still sitting in his tree when he looked down and saw the Lion and said, "Why, Lion, who can that there be?" Lion said, "It's me." Monkey rapped, "Why, Lion, you look more dead than alive." Lion said, "Monkey, I don't want to hear your jive. Monkey just kept on signifying, "Lion, you for sure caught hell. Mr. Elephant's done whipped you for fare thee well." Why, Lion, you look to me you've been in the precinct station and had the 3rd degree. Else you look like you've been high on gauge and done got caught in the monkey cage. You ain't no king to me. Facts, I don't think that you can even as much as roar. And if you try, I'm liable to come down out of this tree and whip your ass some more. I added the ass, but they put tail in there. The monkey started laughing and jumping up and down, but he jumped so hard the limb broke and he landed on the ground. When he went to run, his foot slipped and he fell flat down. Roar. The Lion was on him with his front feet and his hind. Monkey hollered, "Ow, I didn't mean it, Mr. Lion." Lion said, "You little flea bag, you, while I'll eat you up alive." "I wouldn't have been in this fix at all, wasn't for your signifying jive." "Please," said Monkey, "Mr. Lion, if you just let me go, I got something to tell you. Please, I think you ought to know." Lion let the monkey loose to see what his tail could be. And Monkey jumped right back up. Monkey jumped right back on up into his tree. "What I was going to tell you," said Monkey, "is you square so-and-so. If you fool with me, I'll get Elephant to whip your head some more." Monkey said the Lion, beat to his unbooted knees, "You and all your signifying children better stay up in them trees." Which is why today, Monkey does his signifying a way up, out the way.
Wonderful. I'm reminded as I'm listening of how important strategizing, thinking how to survive. How do you survive? How do you endure? How do you get out of your situation? How do you stay alive? And you do it by talking and figuring out how to use language and you know, how to use cunning and not always compassion. I think in the European folktale tradition, compassion is such an important virtue. And you know, I was astonished by in these stories. You know, it does happen, but in very small doses. One of the stories that I found most fascinating, or the set of stories that I found most fascinating, was a kind of counter-narrative to the Flying Africans. So as I looked at all these stories that we'd seen that contained flying Africans and read Song of Solomon and looked at the afterlife of the flying Africans in fiction in the novel, I began to wonder, why are almost all of the men? It's true that I read the end of a story where you have women, men, and children, but usually it's the flying African who goes back, who returns home, whose soul goes back. And one day it occurred to me, oh my God, you know, there are all these witches, these hags who ride. And I'm going to read one called Skinny, Skinny, Don't You Know Me, which is about one of these hags. And these are agents of disorder and unruliness. They love to inflict suffering on other people. They become the source of evil. And they're then connected with a whole voodoo culture. They create a lot of trade in amulets and various talismans used to ward them off. So here's Skinny Skinny. Once there was a woman that could turn into a witch. When her husband would go to bed, she would slip out. While she was gone, the husband missed her and got up. He saw her skin lying by the fire. He got some red pepper and put it inside the skin. Then he locked the door to keep her from coming into the house that night. When she came back, she slipped through the keyhole and went to get into her skin. Every time she went to get in, the pepper would burn her. She would say, "Skinny, Skinny, don't you know me?" Then she would try again. It would burn her still. She would say, "Skinny, Skinny, don't you know me?" The husband woke up. She got into it, but she could not stay. Then she was tarred and burned to death. End of story. Suffering, no strategizing or survival in this particular story. But these are really hair-raising, and you can imagine sitting around talking about these hags who might ride you that very evening, who might make you suffer. And, you know, at the time there was something called, well, today too, sleep paralysis. And how do you explain that? How do you explain night terrors and all of those terrible...
Got a hex on you, that's what...
Yeah, exactly.
The hates.
Hag-ridden, yes.
Yeah. What do you want me to read now, boss?
So, well,
She's
let's
in charge. You want two bundles, or you want Brer Rabbit?
Oh, two bundles would be
Okay.
fantastic. And then we wanted to leave some time for questions. So maybe, Gavin, how about two bundles and then questions? Or
Where is
I've
it?
lost track of time.
Well,
So-
6 minutes till quarter till.
Okay, I think we have time for two bundles.
Okay.
and if you want.
This is from Zora Neale Hurston, and it's an origin story. There are a lot of explanations of why black people are this and that. My father loved telling a creation story, which was why black people have black skin, thick lips, kinky hair, and it's always at the expense of the black person. You know, it was always a Chinaman, a white man, and a black man. And they were picking, one day he's passing out colors. And so, and the reason a black man, of course, is black is that he fell asleep in the sun, and so he gets roasted. So it's always at the expense of black person, which is a very interesting genre. But this is two bundles, and it explains why white people had knowledge and black people were doomed to work. Don't ever worry about work, said Jim Presley. Never worry about work, says Jim Presley. There's more work in the world than there is anything else. God made the world and the white folks made work. Yeah, they made work, but he didn't make us to do it, Joe Willard put in. We brought that on ourselves. Oh yes, the white folks did put us to work too, said Jim Allen. Know how it happened? Well, after God got through making the world and the varmints and the folks, he made a great big bundle and let it down the middle of the road. It lay there for thousands of years, and old Mrs. said to old Massa, go pick up that box, I want to see what's in it. Old Massa looked at the box, and it looked so heavy that he says to the nigger, go fetch me that big old box out there in the road. The nigger been stumbling over that box for a long time, so he'd tell his wife, woman, go get that box. So the nigger woman, she returned to get the box. She says, I always like to open up a big box because there's nearly always something good in great big boxes. So she ran and grabbed a hold of the box and opened it up, and it was full of hard work. That's the reason the sister in black works harder than anybody else in the world. The white man tells the nigger to work, and he takes and tells his wife. Now that ain't the reason niggers is working hard, Jim Presley objected. This is the way that it was. God let down two bundles about 5 miles down the road. So the white man and the nigger raced to see who would get there first. Well, the nigger outrun the white man and grabbed the biggest bundle. He was so scared the white man would get it away from him, he fell on top of the bundle and hollered back, oh, I got here first and this biggest bundle is mine. And the white man says, all right, I'll take your leavings. And he picked up the little teensy bundle laying in the road. When the nigger opened up his bundle, he found a pick and shovel and a hoe and a plow and a chop axe. And then the white man opened up his bundle and he found a writing pen and ink. So ever since then, the nigger, ever since then, the nigger been in the hot sun using his tools. And the white man been sitting up figuring, ought to ought, figures a figure, all for the white man, none for the nigger. And that's Isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that packs a bag. You know, I think what is wonderful, it's from Zora Neale Hurston's Mules and Men. And the beauty of that collection, she called Folktales Big Old Lies.
Like my mom.
And yeah, Big Old Lies. And then use the spyglass of anthropology to go back to her hometown where she was an outsider, but she managed to become an insider. And then not just give a story, but also social context. I think it was Boaz who told her that, you know, if she just gave us one story after another, it would be a little boring. And it's hard to, you can't read through this volume. You have to sort of dip into it, read one story at a time. And so she provided the social context, so you get revisions. Oh, that's not how I heard it. The beauty of the folktales is told in so many different versions, and you know, when I hear it from you, well, that isn't how I read it.
Right. Well, you know, and
So,
part of the problem is, how do you render speech? Again,
Yeah.
it's the trick of dialect. Dialect is written for people who don't speak it. It's an, well, I called it in Signifying Monkey an oral hieroglyphic, because it's a visual sign meant to suggest a sound. But nobody who speaks dialect speaks it that way, right? And so I remember in the 8th grade, my teacher, all my teachers were white, except I grew up in this white Irish-Italian paper mill town. And Mrs. Bright called me Lewis. And I was a good student. I loved literature, though I was going to be a doctor, like every other smart person I knew. And I remember in prose and poetry, that's what it was called, prose and poetry. We had an anthology. She had me read Paul Laurence Dunbar. And, you know, she read it, and she was like trying to wrap her mouth around this rendition of black dialect. And I wondered, what language? I wonder if he's Hungarian or something. You know? And I got home, and I had the feeling, because there was a way that white people look at you. You know, if a white person, no offense, but a white person asks you, do you know somebody? You could bet $1,000 that person's black. They would just, they do. They go, you know, so Roy Jones. You go, no, but I bet he's black. They go, how'd you know that? It's true. Now I forget why I'm telling this lie. What am I?
Well, actually, I think, you know, just drawing attention to the fact that what is told in communal circles or oral storytelling cultures doesn't always work on the written page.
Yes. Oh, that was my punchline was a lot of the stuff was written down by white people.
True. Yeah,
So most of the collectors were white, and they were transcribing it. They would record it, but you know, they have a habit of, like, when black people tell a story, they would say the monkey, the lion. But these guys would just say monkey and lion. The reason is when you talk really quickly, sometimes the articles just drop. So the monkey, but if you say it fast enough, monkey, lion. But really, anybody who heard it would know you were saying the monkey and the lion. So you read these things, it just says monkey does this, lion does this. You go, why the hell did you do that? But it's because they were not hearing it right. Then they're sort of inventing a dialect that is approximating how black people actually speak. So when I'm reading these things, I'm reading them differently even than they were rendered in the book, because I'm black. I have my own way of telling these stories, and I'm 67, and a lot of these stories I'm hearing my father tell them, like ought, you know, that end of that ought for art, figure for figure. My father said that a million times. And one of the reasons it's so important is that you would think that if you were enslaved, that all you're worried about is feeding yourself and surviving, you know, the brutalities of the cotton field. But people sat around and speculated about their origin, their nature, their oppression, you know, why they were being oppressed. Were there ever free black people? Could you ever be free? All these metaphors of freedom. They spent a long time reflecting on their moment of being. You know, they're philosophizing about the nature of being through these folk tales. And I find that very, very impressive. Maria and I were talking. I remember I used to love to shoot marbles. And we shoot in the dark, in the grass, in the dirt, I'm sorry. And I had these beautiful marbles because I got them from my grandfather after he died, and he left them to my father gave them to me. And I was about 4 or 5 years old, or however old. And all of a sudden, I was just, it wasn't dramatic, but I was watching myself shoot marbles. It was as if I raised up and I was looking down, and my cousin Greg and my cousin Jerry were shooting marbles. And I was so astonished that I asked them, have you guys ever been playing marbles and watched yourself shooting marbles? And my cousin Greg looked at me and said, what are you talking about? Shut up, shoot the marbles. So I went home and I told my mother. And you know what my mother said? My mother called me Skippy. She said, Skippy, you're a very special person. Not everybody, that only happens to some people. And she said, and when it happens to you again, don't tell anybody. Just tell me. Isn't that interesting? And I use that to tell my students, you have that double consciousness. You can do a thing and watch yourself doing a thing. That's what happened to me. And that's why I'm a commentator. That's why we're scholars, right? We watch events and we write about them. And That's what the slaves did through all these stories. They're all reflections on their state of being. So it means that they were just as philosophical as Hume and Kant and Hegel, but they found their own philosophical discourse, which is folktales and mythology to tell that story. I find that beautiful. It just means that my African and African-American ancestors were just as complex as anyone else's ancestors. And I like that. That's the implicit political purpose for me to doing it. The other thing is like an homage to my father, you know, in this great tradition of lying and swapping stories. You know, it's great.
And I think everything that you're saying reminds me of how you really need the symbolic to navigate the real. So you can't survive without, you need the stories, you need nourishment, of course, and you need companionship, and you need sleep, but you can't live without this kind of tradition, without stories that, you know, let you think about what if, and imagine what could be and should be and might be.
Yeah, and for everyone that's about your state of being, there are 10,000 about sex. But that was one of the problems
I hear
too.
it now too.
Yeah,
well,
that
absolutely.
they wouldn't, there were certain things that people would say to a white auditor, and then there were lots of things that good white liberal scholars would not write, would not print, because they didn't want to embarrass the Negro. So these shine and signifying monkey tails, they would clean them up. And they would clean them up because they were scandalous.
Guilty as charged.
Huh?
Guilty as charged.
Guilty as charged. You didn't do it. But the, no, imagine if someone had printed this in the 20s, talking about motherfucker and pussy and stuff like, you know, people would say, what are you talking about? And even black people would not have wanted those words included because it would embarrass the race. And everybody black in here understands. You know, you were told, I was raised, you cannot go out and embarrass the race. No matter what you do, don't embarrass the race. The swimming pool, the schools integrated in my little Irish Italian town in 1955, right after Brown v. Board, like immediately. But the swimming pool, it took a couple years more. Why? Because of nudity, black bodies, white bodies, you know, people look at each other, and then they do something about it. But my mother, I was 7 years old, and I loved going to the swimming pool, every day. And my mother would give my brother and me Avon moisturizing cream. And she would say, when you get out of the water, dry yourself off, and put this cream on because you're gonna get ashy. Your skin's gonna, we call it ash, or crust. And she said, you can't let white people see you ashy. So you can't embarrass the race. So I don't know what I look like. I must look like a minstrel. I get out and put that white cream all over myself. Because my mama didn't want me to embarrass the race. And so imagine what the dilemmas that collectors faced when they were trying to help the Negro. Everything was helping the Negro because of the Civil Rights Movement. And if you printed all of this vulgarity, it would have been taken by racists as another sign of the depravity of black people, blah, blah, blah. But if you went to a barbershop or you were in an all-black setting, people talked about it freely, and that was great. Talked about niggers this, and motherfuckers that, and all that, and that's what we were raised with. So there was a kind of public Negro and a private Negro. Above ground, it's like Yiddish, I would imagine. I don't speak Yiddish, but I have a lot of Jewish friends who talk about, you know, you'd be Yiddish at home, and then you'd be a faux wasp when you went to Columbia, you know. And navigating that space was very important and very, very exciting. And women would have their own signifying rituals about men, though I was never privy to them. But when I grew up, a black anthropologist at UCLA, Claudia Mitchell-Kernan, wrote about the way women would talk about men. And Zora Neale Hurston, remember I said that she disappeared? One of the reasons she disappeared was she was disappeared by black male writers, because at the height of the action of the novel Their Eyes Are Watching God, Janie, who's being oppressed by her husband, talks about his impotence. She says, when you take down your trousers, you look like the change of life. And their black men were all in this store, and one Sam Watson says, great God from Zion, y'all playing the dozens tonight. And her husband goes crazy, you know, he goes, what did you say? Because she had talked about their sexuality in public, in front of other men. Nobody ever did that in a novel, nobody. And Zora makes that a woman liberating herself over her man in 1937 by talking about his sexual impotence. And there were a lot of people, starting with Richard Wright, who hated her for doing that and said that she was playing to the voyeuristic fantasies of white people, blah, blah, blah. They basically trashed her and hoped that, you know, that nobody would buy her novels. That's amazing. So I have loved writing about this underground culture. You know, this, what Du Bois said, behind the veil, when you lift the veil, that the Negro lives behind the veil and unveiling. And though it's sexist and raw and nasty, you know, and vulgar, that's the culture. And I think that our responsibility is to tell that story.
Yeah, respect history.
Yeah.
And we should take some questions.
Yeah.
I think.
Is there an audible.com version of your book? And if so, who read it? And if not, should there be, and who should read it?
Well, I think there should be. There's not.
Yeah.
Why not create a website when we put, you know, there are thousands of versions of these stories, right? So create a website that aggregates all the different sources, because most of them are in the public domain, and then add, and they're recordings that people have done. Bruce Jackson, in a book published by Harvard, no less, in 1974, called Get Your Ass in the Water and Swim Like Me, which is a reference to Shine, has a disc. I can't believe Harvard published this book in 1974. But they found black storytellers, black men who were prisoners, and who would just sit around telling stories all the time. And I'm not sure all of them are prisoners, or some of them are prisoners, and they would use the filthiest language, and you can actually play. And I make my students listen to them, not make them, they're delighted to hear all that. But I don't think our editor at Norton wanted us to publish the racier versions.
I think there was a little bit of editing there,
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
not going to blame anyone.
But, so we should do that, right?
Yeah, but you know, and
I would
ask all
want
the
to read
questions
some.
that
I
you're
would want to
interested in.
read
I was
some.
going to say, there's the voice.
No,
we
one of them.
need- Yeah, well.
You could be the white
he
lady.
doesn't.
Some of the stories obviously deal with the situation here in America. I was wondering on things, let's say, like the animal stories. Can those be traced back to Africa, or is that not known?
Sure. Maria?
Oh, well, when Joel Chandler Harris was collecting, or let's put it this way, putting the stories into his own collection, putting a frame around them, all of those stories about animals, animal fables, he understood them to have their origins in Africa, that they did go back there. And he became a member of the American Folklore Society, was very interested in exploring well, the origins of these. I always am uncomfortable about using the term origins or referring to the original, because there never is. There's always the fantasy of, oh, there's the Ur-Märchen, the Ur-Folktale out there somewhere. So they just circulate in all of these variants, and then, you know, from Africa they cross the Atlantic and mix with all kinds of indigenous cultures.
So there's a Tar Baby story from Ghana, what's now Ghana, right? The Anansi stories, which Anansi is the spider. So obviously, we now know from the transatlantic slave trade database that of the Africans brought to the United States, what's now the United States, about 11.6% came from what's now Ghana, right? So you wouldn't have to know that, and that's by looking at shipping records. It's a huge database. You could look it up right now if you have the internet. And it looks at about 36,000 voyages of slave ships. But you wouldn't even have to know that if you just heard these tales and read it. If you read a collection of Akan, A-K-A-N, which is an ethnic group in Ghana, tales and African American tales, you say, oh my God, some slave brought this story with him. When Maria talks about critiquing the whole idea of origins, it's because a lot of these stories are in all kind of cultures. So nobody knows where it came. You know, it came from Adam and Eve. You know, I mean, only God knows. Like, there are rabbit tails all over, and so we don't know. But Anansi is trying to capture his rival, this fairy witch, called, what's her name, Monisha, or something like that.
Yeah.
And so he makes a gum doll and puts a bowl of yams, very desirable, in her lap. And that's the same story. It's the same tar baby story. So I don't know if it came from Ghana, but there are other versions of tar baby.
Oh, yeah, well, you can go to India. The real question becomes, who wrote the story down first?
Right.
That then becomes the original. And you know, if you, there's a folklorist who collected South American tar baby stories. I think not a couple of dozen, but over 100 versions of the story. And that tale to me is one of the most powerful ones in this collection because to me it seems to model passive resistance, the power of passive resistance. It's not just, you know, oh, you can throw me anywhere you want, but not in the briar patch, but it's also, I am going to remain mute. I am going to be silent, and that's how I will fight you. And you will get stuck. You will lose this battle.
And the tar baby's black, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so it's,
But that story has sort of become radioactive now, I think.
You mean politically?
Yeah, politically.
Yeah, but I hate political correctness. I
Thank
mean,
you,
really,
yeah,
you know,
yeah,
it
yeah.
takes
But
all the fun.
remember
It's like a bunch of
Romney,
Puritans editing the, you know, folk tradition.
Yeah, when Romney referred to, was it the Big Dig? Was it kind of?
It could have.
He didn't want to touch that tar. Reports about it in every newspaper.
Oh, I'd use
inappropriate.
I published an essay in the New York Times Book Review, I don't know, 20 years ago, and a bunch of anthropologists wrote, I mean, like 50, I used the phrase, it was voodoo, meaning it was, you know, made up. And then they trashed me for doing that, right? But I wanted to write back. You see, you can never have the last word. So if you're attacked, all you can do is correct facts. You have to, no matter, don't hit that send button when you're defending yourself, because you will lose. Because they can always respond and they'll find something else to whoop your ass about. And really, you know, I have friends that, no, please, no. Wake up in the middle of the night and, well, I'm going to send that letter. And I would have said, if of course I know about Vodun, the religion. If I mentioned the religion, I would have said Vodun, not voodoo. It's just you know, asshole, leave me alone. But no, I think that this, on the one hand, it's good that minorities and women have the right to say, I find this offensive. And I'm not talking about sexual behavior, I'm talking about language. And but the bad thing is that you get the thought police who can say, no, don't use a 12-letter word that begins with an M, or Romney can't talk about the tar baby, and when does it, who can use that? I mean, it's ridiculous to me, you know. I hate it. You know, I hate censorship of all forms. That black censorship is just as bad as white censorship as far as I'm concerned.
And there is, you know, the net result was that the story disappeared. It vanished. And I think we were trying to reclaim stories that had undergone this incredible vanishing act. But
So maybe we'll do another edition. We'll do the adult version. And we'll sell it in a brown paper bag. You know. We got the real version for $59.95. You know. Got pictures too.
A comment and a question. First is that the scorpion story has been usurped for the Middle East, where the scorpion and the camel crossing the Jordan, and why did you say
there you
we're
go.
both going to die? Well, that's the Middle East.
There you go.
Second is the question, to what extent are these folk tales preserved among the younger generation with all of the internet and cartoons and so on? Is there any awareness of the students that we teach today of these stories?
That's a good question. In my experience, in your experience, no. I mean, unless they have had sensitive teachers who have taught. One of the reasons we did this was to create a canon of these folk tales. There are a zillion collections of folk tales, but nobody reads them or teaches them, really, unless you're a specialist. So, and nobody tells them at home. I mean, there's a whole new generation of telling them. I think Tar Baby got a new life when Toni Morrison's novel, Tar Baby, was published, of course. But by and large, I don't think that, you know, there was a copy. I had Mother Goose and Joel Chandler Harris, and I told Maria this. You know, Joel Chandler Harris, a white guy, made a lot of money ripping off black people, right? But in my house, nobody said that. They just picked up the book and said, read this. This is Brer Rabbit, that this guy, I didn't even know Joel Chandler Harris was white when I was a little kid. Nobody even talked about that. He had just collected all the Brer Rabbit stories. But then later, when I grew up, I learned that, you know, people said he had appropriated the culture and exploited the culture and et cetera. So I don't know what this generation is being read. When I know what we read to my kids, because we read them all Brer Rabbit stories, you know, but I'm different. But now, with Norton's imprimatur, that will be a different thing. What do you think?
And I think you can see how the oral storytelling tradition is still alive. You witnessed it tonight. And then these stories have a strange way of migrating into novels, print culture, into new media. And there's a strange way in which I think anyone who reads this volume is going to find that of the 150 or so tales, there are about 50 which sound strangely familiar because you've encountered them in some place. It may not have been in that communal storytelling setting, but maybe in a film. The scorpion, doesn't the story of the scorpion and the frog appears in The Crying Game?
Yes.
It's a narrative that, it's a story that is told there because they're good to think with. These are stories that, you know, not only do we need the symbolic to navigate the real, but we need these stories to make ourselves smarter and to think about, you know, what are the stakes in this particular situation? How do they apply to this or to that? So I think actually I found that in my courses, it's true that when I teach a course on the fairy tale, fantasy literature, and myth, the students come and they know Disney and they've watched Disney 100 times. You know, they've watched The Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast, and they think that that is the original. Many of them do, but many have also been adventurous readers and have you know, read different collections. And I think they're onto this very quickly, and they get really excited about the fact that these stories do exist in so many different versions. And that, you know, there are multiple cultural legacies, but they're also connected. So here I was looking at some of the fairy tales, fairy tale collections, and discovering that there are plenty of, they're not just African animal stories, but also lots of fairy tales. Magic happens. Mm-hmm. There's a high coefficient of weirdness in the stories where you say, what is happening here? And one day I'm reading and I realized that the story in this collection of African tales is just like the Grimm's The Juniper Tree. Mm-hmm. This horrifying story about a stepmother who chops up her son and cooks him up in a stew, which is eaten by the father. I thought it existed only in Germany and in some European cultures, but really it's all over the world in different versions. And I love the way these stories do connect us and give us something to talk about.
And if Joel, I was just going back to our text, Joel Chandler Harris wrote down 263 tales, with nearly half featuring Brer Rabbit. And this is Maria's note, and she says, but both Uncle Remus and Joel Chandler Harris have their defenders. Remus's innocence is more strategic than pastoral. He's never as guileless as he seems, one critic asserted. Another critic raised the ante by concluding in his analysis of the collection that Brer Rabbit is a trickster disguised for Remus, who in turn is a trickster disguised for Harris himself. And a third agreed, adding that Harris's strategies as a writer are much like those used by Uncle Remus and Brer Rabbit. Quote, each presents himself as a benign figure in full compliance with expected mannerisms and behaviors. Meanwhile, behind the smiles, the same threesome busies itself, each on his own level, with the exposure and demolition of stereotypes. So it's complicated. You know, do you have to be, if someone said that I couldn't teach Shakespeare because I'm not mostly of Anglo-Saxon descent, I'm sure everyone in this room would sign a petition saying that person was racist, right? So where does the line start and stop? Who has the right to analyze someone else's culture? Who has the right to write them down, right? It wasn't like there was a level playing field in 1880 with with black people having equal access to the so-called means of production that black people did. But on the other hand, he wrote them down. And one of the reasons they're here is that he wrote them down, and he made so much money it inspired other people to write them down, including black people at Hampton University. And it inspired the black writer Charles Chestnut to write short stories and novels based on black folk tales because a white guy had done it. And Chestnut, who's black from North Carolina, says, God, if a white guy can do this, I'm black. I should be able to do it, make more money, right? So it's complicated. Cultural appropriation is complicated. Cultural preservation is complicated. I want everybody to have access to my black ancestors' creation and to feel it's their own, but I want to feel like a citizen of the world. I feel the Greeks belong to me. Homer belongs to me. You know, Zeus belongs to me, and I've always felt that. And I don't want somebody telling me that that's not true because I'm black, right? So I want Brer Rabbit to belong to the little white kid from Brookline or wherever.
Well, I can just listen to the ancestry. That's what Toni Morrison tells us. And yeah, those voices are so powerful, and they give us dense little golden nuggets of wisdom.
And no one's done more to preserve those folk tales and multiple traditions than my friend, Maria Tatar. Give it up.
Both of our speakers this evening, and just let everyone know that we have a couple books left for sale, although I think we sold almost all of them before the program, which is a record for us. But I'm sure both of our speakers would be happy to sign books and answer questions in the lobby. So thank you very much.
So you want us to come down? Great.